Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the batch video for the web novel Thieves' Dungeon from the website Royal Road. This video will contain chapters 2.9 to 2.12, and as always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 2.9, The Great Reef. I cannot see her anymore. What do you mean, you don't see her? I mewed to the scryer, Toma, through one of my dungeon avatar cats. Toma gulped and stared awkward and unsure at me. The false inked eyes and the head blinked in unison with the real ones. I could see the reflection of the orange tabby with a jewel on its forehead in its eyes. And I could care less how pretty the body looked. I wanted to know where Umi was. The last time I saw her, she was in Colton, heading towards the tower. But now I see nothing, just blackness and searing pain in my tattoos. I'm sorry. Oh, Great Sydney, I'm so sorry. If you are so sorry, instead of prostrating, pet me. I mewed, stretching this body in frustration. I've been in a dungeon call for 18 years, so I knew enough of what was going on. It was the interference of the gods again, as the seer pet away and continued to apologize for his achievement of sight failing me. I lamented in silence. It had been 18 years. 18 years since I woke up as a dungeon call with an intellect on par with that of a human. 18 years since I died and I was reincarnated. To think that my past life, those 18 years, had been pampered at Orange Tabby in a world full of technology instead of magic weighed down on me. No, they didn't weigh down on me now. I cherished and missed those days, and Umi and her family had helped me remember them fondly. Umi, with her strong-headedness, and a younger brother Ria, with his creativity, and her mother Ura, with her emotions and caring, and her father Byrne, with the stubbornness and a habit to travel in his profession. Of all the families that lived in the open-air first floor of my dungeon, the Great Reef of Sydney, I loved them the most. I had already given Ura the achievement of home and Bryn the achievement of horizons that I had obtained from devouring the pesky coastal dungeon, and I would have given Umi the achievement too if she hadn't left. I'd just have to wait for her to return. Hopefully she would be back before Ura gave birth or Ria underwent his trial of adulthood and ventured down into my dungeon's third floor to attempt to retrieve the enchanted treasure for himself. The petting ended and Thomas scurried off to wallow in his ineffectiveness, leaving me to ponder to myself alone again. I retracted my will from the dungeon avatar cat and focused myself 5 floors deep into a beautiful temple of my dungeon core. A voluptuous cat-eye opal rested on a velvety pillow. It truly was fit for a queen like me. But it was lonely without Umi's antics, lonely even with an entire tribe bustling above me and around my dungeon's first floor. The countless trapped and living in my dungeon's third floor until they won the enhanced treasure that would let them leave, and my many various dungeon avatar cats and their many evolution offshoots, all tied me to a complex schema with the innate power of my call's phenotype. Bored, I shifted my gaze to the third floor, finding its guardian with ease. The oversized puma, blessed with the plundered achievement of gloom and horizons, lounged on a bathing rock underneath an outcropping of crystals that gave off warm rays of light and held up the artificial sky of the ceiling. He was John Doe, one of the few things, or rather beings, that I was able to drag from my past life to this. He possessed the soul of a black cat, and I lived with it and outlived. "What do you want?" murmured John Doe through the telepathic link. "I'm bored, and I miss Umi. More dreams of Earth." "Yes, I miss them too," John Doe noted, melancholy filling his voice before abating as he continued. "But we'll see them soon, no? You'll catch their souls soon enough." "If it only was that simple," replied back. Frustrated with my luck, even with my improved achievement of home letting me direct all my overflows back to Earth, I have only managed to gain snatches of memory and assorted goods that I could care less for. I just want to see my family again. "Are we going to continue to mope?" "I am not moping," I hissed in anger. I could feel John Doe being equally playful and bored of me. "Well, I sense more people entering this floor. I'm going to go play with them." With that, I saw the giant puma get up and stretch itself before slinking away into the shadows, almost invisible. I could see the people that he was talking about, and they weren't from the Sydney tribe. They were likely to die quickly under John Doe's deadly playful paws. But I could care less. Their soul fragments were drops in the bucket now. Drawing back into myself, I plotted. If I saved as much mana as possible, I could feasibly force an overflow in 2 weeks. If I told the tribe to convince more foolish adventurers to try their luck for enhanced treasures, as if I would let them steal my precious creations, those were for the worthy and Sydney tribe only. More frustration and boredom, so deep that even near the constant petting I felt through my many dungeon avatar cats was not enough. Without Ubi, I felt wrong. She was my replacement for the girl who adopted me, the girl that cared for me. Emotions swelled up inside of me, but these emotions weren't just frustration and boredom anymore. I felt something familiar, up on the first floor. And it was Alahai's hut. Ura was giving birth in that baby's soul. It was Anna. It was her soul. Taking over control of the nearest dungeon cat avatar, I sprinted to see the baby. I had to see it. I could feel Anna's soul. The girl who adopted me, raised me, cared for me. She was here now in this world. Sydney, you came to see the baby, panted Ura, pained from childbirth. Ria was in the corner, watching his midwife handed his mother the newborn. I came. She's special, I mewed. Let me see her. Let me see Anna. Anna. A lovely name here. The mother panted before struggling slightly and revealing the newborn face to me. Oh, it even looked like Anna. I felt something well up deep inside of me. Not just me, but the body I was inhabiting also. Maternal instinct. She was my caretaker in my previous life, and now she was here and vulnerable, and it was only natural that I would decide to be her caretaker. Let me bless her, I mewed before gracefully climbing up to Ura's stomach and placing a paw on the newborn Anna. With a slight cry from her, I drew out a single bead of blood from her arm. As the bead of blood was absorbed into the dungeon avatar's cat's claw, I saw the grey space where the contracts were formed. On the other side of the stone tablet, I could see Anna's soul. See, the memories of her past life were fading and fragmenting before she could question anything. I acted fast, striking hard with my will. I forced my contract onto her before her memories could fade. Between Anna Alahi and the great reef of Sydney, this contract shall be sacred. Sydney will help and raise Anna. Anna will receive the attunement of home and not forget her past life. Anna will grow up remembering her past life on Earth. Sydney will grant the bounties and achievements of her dungeon to Anna. The grey space faded away and once again was greeted with the tide of the Ura and the newborn, Anna in the hut, and I could see the faint twinkle of knowing and intelligence in her eyes, and I knew my quick thinking had paid off. This is a sense of relief. I went to give the second achievement, the achievement of cats, so that she may gain the grace and charisma of a cat. But before I could give her another, I felt a push back. My current mana wasn't enough to give her a third attunement. The number passed through my head and I realized this. Once I nearly refilled my reserves of mana, the third attunement would be possible, but a fourth would not. No, the cost was too much. Talk about the maximum thresholds and overflows that I was obsessed about. I would need to grow bigger, grow stronger, richer with mana so that I could grant Anna more bounties and achievements. This is a special child, Ura, I mewed. I promise that I'll help her with her upbringing, as I owe her for the very least. Oh, great Sydney, thank you for blessing me with a holy child, cried Ura with cheers of joy. I did not correct her, even though it wasn't I who had blessed her. No, this was a stroke of cosmic luck. And Anna, she would be a holy child. I would guarantee that. End of chapter. Chapter 2.10 Nida. I watched the formation of 3 interlocking runic circles within my core. They were slowly drifting apart, the outermost of the triad starting to distort. One by one they burst into the component characters, the tiny golden ruins wavering in the reflections on the surface of the water as they scattered apart, before fading to nothing. I purged the poison, but the damage was already done. The attunement of the skies was breaking apart, shattering into scatterings and fading gold. It looked beautiful from a distance, the outermost ring of my 5 expanding into a spray of golden letters that drifted out into the dark, little sparks breaking away from the phantasmagorical colors of the rift. That tiny fracture, Medusa's jellyfish. Sometimes I knew things without understanding how I knew, as if the memories were coming unconscious from the time before I could recall. But I didn't like to dwell on my creation. Always, within the thought of how I came into existence, there was a sickening possibility that, some day, I might cease to be. In fact, it was possible that I already had, or at least this body had. According to what Strix had told me, Olin Framp had believed to have killed the soul within my core, and he bound me to his will. Maybe he was mistaken, or possibly he was precisely right. It was possible that he wasn't the first inhabitant of this core, that I'd undergone some soul migration that Kobachan had. Certainly I recognized nothing of myself in the description he'd given. Living on a farm, the pet of some human family, it was an image of ludicrous ideal that stirred nothing but contempt in me. Humans were greedy, savage, and most of all unsightly. Living in harmony with them was a dream at best and dangerously naive at worst. Although I had considered farming them, my need for souls was only increasing, and so finding a source beyond hoping adventurers will continue throwing themselves into my waiting teeth would be ideal. Sadly, they were pitifully slow breeders, but it would still be a steady influx. But I was distracting myself, trying to think of anything but the steady dissolution of my attunement. Worse, there was the possibility that rot wouldn't stop here. The somber thought pulled me back to the present. The lattice of geometric shapes were pulling apart, the ends fraying like a rope unwinding into a twine of gold dust. At least it was beautiful. For a moment I stared down at the beast, and it was death considered my legacy. It was glorious, yes, in 1 month I had accomplished so much, but it was all so fragile. Ardent, Oram, Kobachan, they were my children. I needed them stronger. If nothing else, they had to survive, and the humans would have to pay. That, I hope, went out without saying. There would need to be a price to fire and blood for doing this to me. With that thought, I rose from a myopic contemplation with my own inner workings. My attention returned to the dungeon, to Aram and the kobold crowding around me in concern, the black orchard that I created. It was not visibly threatening. The most vicious feature were the long purple-tipped thorns, yet I had an uneasy sense about the flower. To me, it was a clock ticking towards disaster. Destroying it risked dispersing poison mana back into my domain, and so I pondered. While I did, I examined the kobolds as I created. Well, they were not the prettiest of my creations. They weren't as horrific as the rat hound, and they evidenced no aggressive behavior beyond wrestling and snapping at each other as they vied to become the alpha of their little pack. Besides the little bard with his makeshift flute wearing on my nerves, there was no reason to suspect that they were a threat. The worms. I didn't like them at all, but again, they were harmless. I felt maybe a twinge of unease at the rat hound, and the orchard inspired me, but it was far less severe. Whatever I sensed was present in only minute quantities. Poisoned mana. I didn't know enough about these things. My rats were spreading throughout the city, and I could still lack the fundamental knowledge needed to direct them. The net was only catching random, lucky scraps of information, because I didn't know where to place them, which directions they should watch for threats. I would summon Volder. How did that work? Umi howled, as they both ran. They pelted down the endless identical hallways, legs aching and lugs burning. Their panting, ragged breath couldn't cover up the sound of claws scraping as the beast chased after them, letting the high-pitched hiss of anger. Always works, Trevelyan huffed, struggling to keep up with the slim, athletic island woman who was the first of the menu and who got away. He was flat-frecked. Usually this is where he stabbed his partner in the back of the leg and made a run for it, and shouted an apology back as he went. But she had the key clutched in her hand, the octagonal key of Lupus that was their only hope of escape. They turned the corner without glowing. Its long claws scraped on the earth as it moved, not quite on all fours, but bent over at its waist, half running and half hoping its claws spread out before it, feeding the way. It was as blind as a bat. Its hands crawled over the walls like spiders as the two gaping slits of nostrils flared. Another turn and the golden coins were rattling underfoot. The beast was right behind them. It was coming closer. Closer. And Trilblin howled as he felt a claw swipe across his back, opening up an oozing thinned wound, and he grabbed a hold of the coins stacked high on the walls and cast them back behind him. An avalanche of heavy gold. It did nothing but cascade off the creature as it reached for the back of his leg. Searing jolt of panic gave Trilblin the strength to burst forward briefly, outpacing Umi, and that was when she kicked him in the leg. He went down in a tumble, howling with outrage, the injustice of it all. She vaulted over him, dashing towards the door. The octagonal key clicked into the lock, and the handle twisted. The light shone from the edges, and a clawed hand came and closed around his cheek, turning him into his back as he tried to struggle away. He was face to face with a lipless grin, those eyes so wide and veined with tiny blood vessels, confronted by the nostrils that sucked in the scent and flared out, staring at the little hills of yellow bone visible in the seas of pinkish red flesh. "Let me," he started, but the beast slashed him open from the chest to belly. One quickly flash of its claws doing its job, and then they were so sharp that he barely felt the pain until the second layer when the first beads of blood came up. And then he was gone. The golden light surrounded him. Trilblin had just time enough to wonder if he was dying before he was cast out of the tower's doors. Hurtled rudely onto the cobblestones, his hands fluttered over his chest, checking that he was a whole. Not a terrible wound, just a familiar lagus of his gut. Armored boots stepped into view, boots attached to armed men, all shiny in their uniforms, all grim in their faces. Trilblin tried to shift and form and scare them off. For a second, he wore a skinless thing's visage, and two of the younger guards reeled back in shock and horror. He twisted onto his feet and lunged away, but a dwarf tackled him from the side, bringing him down and running on top of him, striking him across the face and shoulders until he shrank back. "Are you a man or a monster? Man or monster?" the dwarf demanded. The first held over the bloody mess of Triblin's handsome mug. "Man!" he cried, lifting his own hands to shield himself from the heavy steel gauntlets that had already smashed his nose to a pulp. Not much of one, the familiar voice made Triblin's blood run cold. Cathara Halfhand peered over at him, her bony face looming into his little patch of sky as he lay in the hard earth, blood trickling from the searing pain in his nose. A shapeshifter. Now that's interesting. Certainly explains how you got away from us. Let me through. At the edges of Triblin's vision, a scrawny nothing of a man with pitch-dark robes was fighting his way through the guards, a heavy insignia of the Magi's Institute swinging on his thin neck. "Damn you, I'm a high mage, and I will be respected." "Let him," Cathara hissed. The mage stared at Trilblin, lifted his lens of the blue glass over his eye. "Where did you get that achievement?" he demanded, his voice almost shaking with excitement. Trilblin opened his mouth and froze. The contract wouldn't let him. His throat seized up, his lungs refusing to pump the breath that would let him speak. God's sights, it was a strange day. He let out a defeated sigh and was just shrugged with an air of nonchalance. He was lying on the ground, and over him towered Cathara, the mage, the god who had tackled him, and Trilblin just lay there, defeated, schemes and wind all knocked out of him. "You won't get anything out of him." Cathara's voice was smug as a cat. "Take him away." As they dragged him to his feet, Trilblin winced. To top it all off, it was a whole crap day. There was something stuck in his boot. End of chapter. Chapter 2.11. The Nameless. Boulder Claith looked around the room with a mixture of pride and apprehension. His former bookshop had been emptied out, his uncle's collection of tombs sold or placed in storage. Workers had been hired, laboring nearly a day and night to remodel his store into a comfortable cafe. He was amazed at the speed of the transformation, but between the profits from his time selling the elixir drinks in the market before the tower was blocked off, and what was left over from the dungeon's golden apples, he had the coin to afford the best builders and craft mages Colton had to offer. They had spent his money freely but efficiently, and in the end result was worth it. The Nameless Cafe was nearly ready to open. Standing in the doorway, looking over his new kingdom, Valder imagined how it would look once he opened the doors officially. From the entrance, one would pass through a few remaining bookshelves, which would hold the last of his store's former stock, cultivating volumes dealing with codices and dungeon lore, monster bestiaries, and other topics his preferred clientele would be interested in. Each of his stamped with an inexpensive but effective rune that would keep it from crossing the threshold unless dispelled at the counter, as well as enhancements to repel liquids and keep the parchment and vellum intact through ill use. The cost was exorbitant, nearly as much as the rest of the remodel, but Valder wasn't going to let some elfish wannabe adventurer destroy his tombs. He considered it money well spent, and if he purchased one of the volumes, he would simply pass the markup on to them, and in time-honored tradition of merchants everywhere. Past the bookshelves was a collection of small tables in all manner of geometric shapes. Customers could sit and read, discuss tactics with allies or strangers, and enjoy a variety of pastries, sandwiches, and other tasty confections, all while imbibing drinks made from Kether's elixir. Facing the rest of the room beyond the tables was a long counter, complete with stools for patrons. While Valder acknowledged that his customers would have certain expectations with regard to their preferred gathering places, he would sooner delve the dungeon as his nightshirt before he called it a bar. Well, perhaps not that, he thought to himself, eyeing the door at the back of the shop while smoothing out his tic that he'd recently developed in his right cheek with his fingertips. Between the counter and the tables on the slightly raised platform was the heart of the whole endeavor, behind glass cases containing samples of the products of one of the best bakeries in the city, but looked like a miniature alchemist's workshop dominating the room. Large canisters, glass bottles, and iron that would allow Valder to dilute the potent concoction, or mix it with a number of different base liquids to entice his patrons into parting with their coins while staying and chatting where he could hear them. This one added a splash of warmed milk, that one added a douse of chilled tea. Meher, before entering the tower, had even discovered a sweet cream liqueur that enhanced the flavor of elixir without dulling its stimulating effects. Valder had spent a number of days experimenting with different combinations to find the ones that would serve his customers, drinking the results himself and judging them based on their taste, presentation, and effectiveness. That he hadn't slept during that period was simply a side effect of his enthusiasm to finish, and if he didn't sleep, he couldn't wake screaming dream of spiders and rats anyway. At the rear of the shop, the back room had been partitioned in two. One half served as a storage and contained a spigot and a basin to clean the equipment, as well as the cups and plates the patrons dirtied. The other half contained his office and room and housed the damnable trap-door to the likeness nightmare that he rested under his coltern. Completing the main portion of the room were a few aesthetic touches. The walls were done in greys and greens, and the floor in shimmering black and evoked the feeling of looking into a bottomless crevasse. And a few sculptures and ascended pieces done by artisans in Sufi's sect who had heard stories of the dungeon from her and Crate half-hand were scattered about. A gold-painted wrought-iron serpent, twisting glass mushrooms, glittering crystalline spider webs stretching towards the ceiling. One of the artists had even painted one of those bizarre-looking but powerful giant sloths on the wall. It gave the space a somewhat eerie feel, but also brought the horrors of the dungeon to the surface and froze them in time, emboldening those who viewed them, filling them with a preemptive confidence that they knew what to expect. Valder felt pity for them. They wouldn't know about the barest fraction of what awaited them below, what he would help them send to. Before he could dwell on the unpleasant thought, he went behind the counter to make himself another drink. Perhaps 2 parts elixir and 6 parts cherry juice. As he mixed and stirred, he envisioned the place as it would be shortly. Bustling and full of customers, he raised his glass to his lips, the sweet, fizzing beverage tickling his nose in a peculiar but pleasant fashion, and then paused and frowned. Customers, crowds! Nolan was still in the tower. This was a problem. "Oh, by the dark gods! Look, Mr. Claith, Seamus Aronson. His family was killed by a flight of blood gold drakes, and he was adopted in order with dragon slayers. When he was old enough, he returned to his family's home and slaughtered every drake there. save for one single egg that hatched as he approached, and the creature imprinted on him. So he took mercy on it and kept it as his companion. They say that its armor is made of the scales of those same drakes who killed his family, and his bond with Nuna allows him to summon balls of drake flame to his right hand, which he can throw with a deadly accuracy. Valda massaged his temples as he covertly examined the excited young lady before him for gills, an air bladder, or some other means of taking in a strong extra breath while she spoke incessantly. He wasn't certain that he'd ever seen her inhale. "That's very interesting, Sarashi," he began, sparing a glance at the foreboding, blunt-nosed man in red and golden scale armor, with a small drake perched on his shoulder. Before the energetic, apron-wrapped blend of brown ringlets, shining green eyes, and sunlit brilliant smiles he had hired to serve the patrons turned and indicated another customer sat at the bar counter. Damn it, behind them. And there, that's Alfred Harpart. He was a great duelist. They say that there was no one more skilled with the rapier anywhere in the Amber Court Nation. I heard he retired, took up duty as a man-at-arms and a bodyguard for a noble house. I wonder what he's doing here on his own. Sarashi Cooper paused and tapped her chin with a finger, pondering this great mystery while staring at a solidly built old warrior with a patchwork of scars and missing digits. And the sudden silence, comparatively at least, left Valda momentarily stunned. She hadn't stopped telling him the names and stories of the different mages, adventurers, and monster hunters who had been through the cafe since it had opened. Between working, studying for an entrance exam at the academy, and all the reading I see you do, I'm amazed at how much you seem to know about our patrons, Sarashi. I hope that you aren't pestering them, Valda cautioned. Not only were these people his ticket of fortune, but Kaith's elixir was still selling as fast as they could pour it. The dungeon had instructed him to learn about the adventurers of the city for its purposes, so it wouldn't do to have them driven away by an irresponsible girl hounding them for stories of their supposed exploits. He amended his thoughts as the new employee looked slightly abashed. Woman, Sarashi was a young woman, probably only a year or two younger than him, but her bubbly personality and effortless charm made her seem younger. Or perhaps it was just that she had managed to come through her life thus far without experiencing the kinds of things his patrons had. The kinds of things that he envied her. I'm sorry, Mr. Claith, I just get so excited. I've read stories and heard tales of the bands of roving slayers, of scholars who have unearthed secrets thought lost, and thanks to you, I don't have to wait until I finish my studies at the Mage Academy. I don't even have to wait until I save up to pay my tuition and rub elbows with the kinds of people who tell those stories about. I get to serve them the elixir and cakes and listen to them talk right now. I'm learning so much about what being an adventurer is like. Before I even begin my apprenticeship, I can't thank you enough for hiring me. Only at what having a walking bundle of sunshine around you could do for one's mood, he considered. Oh, you don't know about Junik the Invulnerable. It's said that he is a mighty berserker who can't be slain in battle. But if he doesn't use those healing items before the fight ends, all of those blows he should have felt previously strike him all at once. Her smile had returned in full force, and Sarashi proceeded to regale him with stories that she had heard about the customers until night fell and they pushed the last remaining patron, a short, berobed and mustachioed man who had gotten deep into the cups with some of the more potent mixers on the menu and was constantly referring to himself in the third person, out of the door. As Valda locked the door and engaged the wards that he had the academy neophyte place, before retreating to the office to tally the day's take, Sarashi began to wash the last batch of dirty dishes, slowly sipping at what he promised himself would be the last elixir for the night. He took an inventory and prepared orders, sheets, and runners that would pick up and take the Kaith's workshop, the bakery, and a few vendors in the market first thing in the morning. His work was nearly complete when a shriek filled the quiet air, causing him to freeze in place before bolting out of his chair and into the storeroom. "Mr. Claith, help! A spider!" Sarashi screamed, and his feet tangled themselves up as he stopped moving forward, sending him to the floor. He slowly drew himself back, up peering over the racks of goods to where his employee stood at the wash basin. He knew for certain that he would see her collapse at any moment, frothing at the mouth from some virulent toxin injected into her foot-long mandibles of some dungeon horror. But after a few seconds, she screamed again and pointed. "Please! I can't abide spiders. Take it! Put it outside, please!" Volder blinked and stepped closer. On the floor, under the shelf, indeed, a spider, but as it skittered into the light, he saw no mother-of-pearl sheen to its shell, no malevolent insight in its compound eyes. There, before them, was a regular, ordinary house spider, about the size of a coin. From somewhere within him, a bubbling giggle escaped Volder's lips as he stretched out his leg and stomped down. "The glade, sir! That's enough! I think it's dead. You can stop stomping now." Sorashi looked concerned as Volder came back to himself. He wasn't sure how many times he brought his heel down upon the arachnid, but he strongly disagreed with the woman. It was most certainly not enough. Still, it wouldn't do to have her quit because she thought he was mad. "You are mad, though." He shook his head to dislodge the thought his generous mind delighted in presenting more and more often these days. "Yes, so it is. I'm sorry, Sorashi. I also dislike spiders, and I'm afraid my nerves got the better of me, caused me to overreact. Still, let me get a broom and dispose of the former intruder, and you head on home. I'll take care of the last of those cups." Volder clicked his mouth shut to avoid tripping over his words any further. Sorashi gave him another of her binding smiles and hung her green and black apron from the hook of the wall. "Thank you, Mr. Claith. I'll see you tomorrow," she promised, and then was gone, out of the door in a flash. Volder put action to his words, sweeping the pulped remains of the spider before emptying the wash-tub and putting the plates and mugs away to dry. That done, he rechecked the locks and turned the lanterns into the cafe down, low, never out, and returned to his office to find another spider waiting for him. The crazed giggle that had escaped him before brought friends, shrieking cackles leaping from his lips as the Goliath waited alongside the trap-door. The invitation, obvious and irrefusable. Grabbing a half-empty glass from his desk, he gulped down the remainder of the drink for strength, and to silence of the mad, utterly mad laughter, and then he descended into the dark. He was met at the mouth of the tunnel by his rodent escorts, the spider climbing a wall and returning to its nest as the rats led him through the maze of pitfalls towards the garden. As he shook off the after-effects of the shrinking magic that lunged over the garden, Volder glanced around the gazebo curiously. There was something different about the dungeon, where before there was a constant pressure that from most of the dungeon's awareness covering the entire area. Now it felt somewhat distant, still everywhere, but connected by an individual strands, rather than a singular blanket. It felt like a little being surrounded by invisible spiritual spider webs, and that was an image that he was never going to get out of his head. One more of the many provided by the dungeon. After the short time spent waiting and idly examining the collection of beautiful goblets arrayed within the structure, Koba-chan entered. The arachne looked different, stronger, more robust, and it had all 8 legs again. Volder wasn't sure how to broach this particular subject, and was almost grateful when the other man, Spider, Koba-chan, spoke. "The Maker has gone below. You'll go to him soon to see what he has created. Before then, you will find for him books and poisons, ones that affect mana or are formed from it. Also, records of dungeons bound or destroyed by adventurers. Finally, you will acquire for me the equipment to cut and polish gems, to make jewelry. Spare no expense." Volder swallowed and focused on his words, as he felt the attention of the dungeon and the weight of his contract on him. "Well, the cafe, tavern is doing well, but what you're asking is, I will of course do it, but, it will take time. Information about poisons is regulated, and there are very few academic studies on the process of binding dungeons. It's a major source of power for guilds, even entire nations. But I'll find stories of what was true as possible, in the meanwhile, and find you records where I can, and the equipment." Koba-chan held up a hand and seemed to listen for a moment. Intruders coming down the ravine, a tall man with runes on his face and a brace glass of knives, and a short woman covered in tattoos. Volder's eyes widened at the description. Warwick the Mirror's Edge and Glenna the Painted Woman. You are familiar with these adventurers. What can you tell me of them? Koba-chan asked, intent curiosity. Warwick can use his runes to create mirror images of himself wherever the light reflects from his knife hits the strike from any other reflectives with the blades. He can also throw daggers and move them through the air by will alone. Glenanna is a skilled unarmed fighter, and her tattoos are enchantments. One is supposed to allow her to step on the air, and another to fade into shadow or mist for an ambush. A third that sends the force to a punch with feet further than her reach would suggest. Volder numbly relayed the words Sorashi had told him that afternoon. That is helpful. Remain here, this will not take long. I will test them and see if they are worthy to face the Maker's second level. With the Arachne gone, Volder sunk to the glass floor of the gazebo. Those were his customers, people he'd spoken to. Well, had paid someone else to speak to, earlier that day. He knew that the dungeon had wanted when he'd told him to open up a tavern, to gather information on the fighters of the Cold Turn for it. It was another thing entirely to see it use the information borne out. Volder hung his head for a few moments, trying not to listen to the sudden cry of voices, the clash of glass and knife striking glaive, the hiss of serpents and the chittering of spiders. A quiet return to the dungeon. Volder attempted to steel himself. His deal with the dungeon, one-sided as it was, may have hastened these adventurers' end, but they had chosen to come down here, to risk the peril to them. It would have happened either way. Only a fool would come to this place willingly. Only a fool or a madman. Koba-chan returned, flicking a thin layer of blood from the end of his weapon. They were unworthy, the way is clear. Return to your shop. Come back when you have what is required, and before you quail about the price, as I am certain you will, take this. The dungeon guardian dropped a pouch in Volder's hand. He hesitated for a moment and then pulled the drawstring and peered inside. Resting within was a small number of pearls, golden luster shining even in the darkness. Sell those to finance whatever maker I need. Sell no more than one at a time. You may not tell anyone that they came from the dungeon. You may imply that they ended up in your hands from someone who came to the dungeon. Do you understand? Volder nodded. Well, not as rich in mana as the apples he had already pawned. Even the untrained fourth son like himself could feel the positive energy residing within the pearls. Divine fortune waiting to be spent. Wordlessly, he allowed himself to be led back out the tunnel and up to his room. His attention focused on the weight of the pouch in his hand, and what it would mean. More bait for the dungeon's hooks, a set with a rumour of supposition into the mouths of the greedy, the foolhardy. More webs to trap the unwary and ambitious. It was believed that the treasure was going to be retrieved from the dungeon and traded in his cafe. Then competition would do much to increase the rush into the darkness. He lost track of time sitting at his desk and staring at the pouch until there was a loud rapping at the front door. Rousing himself, he blinked the raw, tired eyes and realized that the sky was just beginning to lighten up over the rooftops of Kaltern. Another day was dawning, and he went to the door, unlocking it to allow Sorashi to enter. "Good morning, Mr. Claith. It looks like it's going to be another beautiful day. Did you give any thought to my idea of putting tables and chairs outside the front door? Customers can enjoy the lovely weather, and people walking will see the drinks and treats, and they be enticed to come inside. We'll be the spiders this time, drawing them into our web to trade their coins for your friend's elixir. Maybe we won't be so scared of spiders then." Dungeon's contract pushed it down. He realized that he was still standing at the door open, closing it and relocating it before going to help Sorashi get ready to open the cafe. She favored him with a smile and assisted her in stocking the cases with fresh pastries and began priming the mixing of brewing equipment. "I really want you to know how much I appreciate you giving me this opportunity, Mr. Claith. It's not just a job. Well, it's that too. I need the money if I'm ever going to get into the academy. But this is so much better than working at the market stall or on some farm somewhere. I get to meet all kinds of interesting people, try all the wonderful drinks you and Keith come up with, and you've never told me off for talking too much. Most people do, you know. I think that's why I have such a hard time making friends usually." She smiled self-consciously as she set the tray of plates on the waiting shelf before dusting off her hands on her apron. "It's fine, Sorashi. I honestly don't mind you talking. You have a pleasant voice." Volder answered absent-mindedly as he brewed himself a mug of tea with an extra dose of elixir. Maybe 2. Or 3. It had been a long night, and his brain caught up with the rest of the words as he took out the first sip. Friends! You think we're friends? Of course we are. You're nice, a little weird maybe, but that just makes you more fun. That's okay, right? And who am I to say if anyone's weird? Look at me, always saying every little thing that pops into my head, obsessing over adventurers and stories. I'm afraid that once I become a mage and go off to do adventures myself, I will be tough to find people who are willing to go into a dungeon with the chatterbox. Volder gripped the painfully hot mug tightly and stepped towards Sarashi. No. Of course it's okay that we're friends, but don't think about going into the dungeons. He retreated suddenly, aware of how close he was standing. You would enjoy your time here, focus on your studies. Besides, the nameless cafe and I will be lost without you. She beamed her signature smile at him and began wiping down the counter and tables, humming to herself. In that moment, Volder found something in him that he didn't even know was there. Resolve. While he might have to help the dungeon and entice adventurers to go and give their lives to the hungry abyss below, he wouldn't let this wonderful bright spark be amongst them. One way or another, he would protect her. Sarashi, if we're going to be friends, please call me Volder. End of chapter. Chapter 2.12. Excerpts 1. N1 Excerpts Part 1. Excerpts from the Notable Dungeon Histories 4th edition, generously donated to the Nameless Dungeon from Volder's library. Historians note there are unfortunately no first-hand accounts of the raid on the tomb of the Eclectrics, the dungeon notorious for sinking ships of the Black Pillar Cliffs. Second-hand accounts have been cross-referenced, and we visited all the sites and the ruins to confirm the some and the more unlikely details. What follows is not strictly true, but largely accurate, and until the Coruscant band deigns to break its silence, the best informed account we have. Local fishermen have become aware of a dungeon growing near the village when the strange fish appeared along the coast, dragging smaller prey through the waters into the newly formed caves along the basalt cliffs. They sent messages to the Adventurers Guild, but it was intercepted by the dungeon, which was already quite powerful and had been monitoring the village for some time. When the fisherman's child was abducted from his boat by a fish, the village this time sent an entire expedition to deliver the message, armed to the teeth. Of the 10 men that left the village, 1 survived, telling the guild of the horrid beasts lurking below the waters, dragging away a bounty of sea into the basalt maw, then how of massive creatures made spiked shells and slime that had ambushed them, and how it had reached out with the spined tendrils and consumed his fellow villagers. The Adventurers Guild quickly assigned an experienced party, thinking that there would be more than a match for the small, previously unheard-of dungeon core. It was a reasonable assumption. The dungeon was unheard of, but near a populous region with heavy ship traffic, so it must be time the ship Empress of Mercy went missing. At the time, the events were considered unrelated. However, the Azarul Merchant Syndicate quickly saw 4 loaded trade ships disappear in a week. The dungeon had clearly realized with the first expedition that it had been exposed and no longer attempted any form of subterfuge. It sought to loot and plunder whatever life and resources it could. Ships of the Azrul coast started traveling in convoys. The first convoy went missing without a trace. The second convoy had 3 ships escape, including a warship Soldier's Fortune. The frigate had escaped with 2 gaping holes in its hull, prevented from sinking only because, by chance, a famed wood-shaper had been traveling as a passenger on one of the merchant ships. The main mast was wrecked and the sails torn as they limped into port. The 2 merchant ships only in slightly better shape. The crew told tales of harrowing beasts, 2-tailed serpent of obsidian and bone that had attacked him. As it did, megalodons with teeth of rocks and colossal squid with iron-spiked tendrils, and the beast ships as well. It was fortunate that they escaped. The battle at sea was a clear sign of the power of the dungeon had accumulated, and the tale spread wide through the lands. Additionally, the convoy had carried goods from the cities ranging from Kulturn to Ankara, Each was impacted by the loss and angered by the deaths of their own innocent people. The Empress too felt the loss, for one of her ships had been carrying the Phoenix feathered cape, the crimson feathers blazing with the divine fire and favor. It was this confluence of tragedy so let many people see past their differences and unite against a common foe. Many malevolent dungeons had that been the case here, the consequences would have been unthinkable. Instead, they developed a plan. The Azrael merchants sent another convoy, this time 3 warships and 10 merchant ships. The fleet took a detour around the dungeon's coast, seeking to avoid it. It was a tempting prize, and still far too vulnerable. The dungeon sent its serpents. It was, of course, a trap. As soon as the serpent attacked the rear vessel, the merchant ship was broken in formation, woodshapers peering down the parts of the seamless hull, revealing 2 rows of mage-fire cannons and stonebreaker ballista, while the wizards of the glory of adventure kept the beast from diving in. Spellwork already prepared was repaired even as the serpent's tail sought to smash it apart. Pierced by dozens of dark iron ballista bolts, the flesh smashed asunder. The serpent, a guardian of the dungeon, died. Its minions were culled too, the mana dispersing into the ocean, unrecoverable. Many of the beasts had shards, and in that moment a great cost of the expedition was refunded twice over. As the dungeon was distracted by the battle, a scouting force led by the shadow-attuned thief Jolman infiltrated the basalt saltwater caverns in the cliffsides. Though it had been known to block divination, the dungeon was still untested, and was at first unaware of the magically hidden group full of thieves and sorcerers. They were able to fully map the first floor. The coast was made of basalt pillars, and the trace amounts of dark iron present in the rocks made magical mapping and penetration impossible. The cavern entrance was on the coast, and within the first floor went deep into the rocks. Though it was open enough to the ocean, this meant that the movement of the waves and tides created a death trap. Slick algae coated the rocks, and the dungeon had hollowed out as tidal pools full of steel-spined urchins and razor barnacles that shot out acid as a defensive mechanism. Oysters opened with brilliant prismatic pearls, tempting them, but they were too disciplined to be caught for such an obvious trap. The base of the cavern, shrouded by the foam and turmoil of the waves, had a seaweed that sought to entrap and pull anyone they tried swimming through it to the entrance. With the waterway and sides both nearly impossible to navigate, Jolman chose one of his classic strategies for the entrance. They took the seeding. With a series of invisible ropes and magical anchored clips, the scouting team made it through the entrance. There they found the rock in the cavern was not just basalt. The plutonic rock covered the old layer of fossil leaden limestone. The dungeon had been busy with it. Even as they watched, Jolman saw the dungeon carving out fossils from the stone and beginning to shape the old bones into monstrosities. They watched as the beasts of calcite scales and a gaping jaw formed and began to swim about the pool of the cavern. Other creatures crept about. The strangest was something like a mantis shrimp, with a brilliant shell resembling a fine polished steel and a glimmering sapphire. It was the size of a bull with huge claws. They watched as it smashed its claws into part of the cavern, causing the walls to crack and splinter, which the dungeon then burrowed into with its mana. Then the beast turned its eye stalks around. Jolman was the first to realize that they had been spotted. The strange eye glanced up at them and lingered a bit too long. He knew of colors that only animals could see. Their invisibility spell was not perfect. As he signaled his team to make back for the entrance, the tide was receding. Below, in the churning waters, Jolman made out of the entrance of the tight underwater passage, just small enough that an unarmed man might be able to squeeze through. It was lined with the razor barnacles and strangeling seaweed, and the ocean would yank and push at anyone trying it. All the while they held their breath. Jolman was the last to leave. As he did, he saw a sight that few have witnessed. The dungeon was reconstructing its guardian bit by bit, mana coalescing into stone and flesh. They escaped just to see the beasts arrive, pulled back from their battle off the coast. 2 colossal squid tried to block their escape, but the thieves were too agile. They fled and made their report. The first victory against what would be known as the Tomb of the Achaeatrix was complete. Again, the first ships of the Azrael Syndicate had not spared the news of the dungeon fast and far. It's troubling to think what would have happened. That the news traveled quickly meant that instead of greedy, but ultimately perishable adventurers mobbing the dungeon looking for easy treasure and glory, an elite team would assault the dungeon before it could prepare. The dungeon, unbeknownst to all, had burrowed 4 levels deep and had somehow gotten its hands on the true soul of the Achaeatrix, the legendary necromancer. But there would be no long siege. The Coruscant band arrived within a week, as the dungeon was still recovering its most potent minions. Jalman joined them as an honorary member, and the Arch-Sorcerer Almara, the Paladin of the Mask of Theum, Supreme Priestess of the Eastern Reaches, and Tath the Torkin, Grand Alchemist, arranged their infiltration. Warships surrounded the dungeon entrance and smashed open the entrance. The cavern was nearly a straight line, so their spellwork and magefire cannons caught the giant sea beasts on the first level in a trap of their own making. The Guardian was slain again, and the Coruscant band simply walked in. Ignoring the traps that the dungeon had installed on the ceiling, they burned through the grasping seaweeds and reached the entrance on the second level within minutes. Here, the dungeon had perhaps anticipated the incensed priests used to keep the dungeon's power at bay that would need to be extinguished for the party to dive into the waters that linked to the second level. It had encountered on Tath Torkin's alchemy. He had worked with the Ilthium to create a substance that would burn underwater. Almara fortified them with a spell of water breathing, and the Paladin of the Mask smashed through the cavern, hammer flashing with a bright starfire as he sundered stone and creature. The entire second level was underwater maze. Here, the giant mantis shrimp hid in the cracks of stone, leaping out and ambushed them. Their claws could crack stone, but they glanced at the Paladin of the Mask's white shield. Eels with stone teeth rushed out, with smaller eels trying to destroy the party with lightning that they stored in their bodies. Almara's spellwork defended them easily, and the whole place was crowded with shadows. And Jalman had been ahead of the party the entire time, staying out of sight of the mantis shrimp, warning them of every ambush, scouting every trap and dead end. The special incense burned fiercely, bright bubbles, bringing holy fire to the place in the depth and cold. The labyrinth cavern ended with the underwater hydra, a beast with 4 heads. The creature was large enough to actually block the entrance to the third level of the dungeon, and each head protruded through narrow openings in different cave halls. Since the heads would quickly regenerate, the party would have to split off and destroy them all at once. And how could fire keep the heads destroyed if they were underwater? The maze was cunningly crafted so that each route was long, but the Coruscant band worked quickly. The Paladin of the Mask had smashed 2 thin walls that Jalman had mapped, allowing them to skip past the winding maze. They confronted the Hydra's head all at once, using Tath Torkin's fierce fires to keep them from regenerating. Here, we enter a bit of the extreme speculation. The dungeon would have no motivation to clear the corpses of the Hydra and allow the adventurers to pass, speeding along their assault. However, no corpse was discovered, only the severed heads. The unnamed source of Colturn's Institute claims that Almara used a secret spell to dissolve the Hydra into a mana for her own spells, thus explaining the sheer quantity of spellwork that she was able to manage in such a short time frame. However, another source said that the claim was absurd, explains the missing corpse by the dungeon dissolving it after the band had already burrowed through the bloated body with some sort of alchemy, or hacked away a hole through it. Alas, the historical debate is unlikely to ever be settled. Vertically carved passages and clever hydrology let the passage lead to a dry cavern. The Coruscant band emerged on the third level, still unscathed. The thick limestone layer of the dungeon had curved through and tilted slightly, so as they proceeded through the gaping caverns of pillars and stalactites, it led them deeper into the earth. By now the dungeon knew of Jalman, but as it thought to send forth its small army of cave-lurking beasts at the band, it must have lost track of him. It must have been an awe-inspiring sight to behold. Tath Torkin lobbing potions that dissolved the stone creatures, prismatic explosions of lightning in the dark, concoctions exploding with unnatural fire and glimmering off the dripping walls of white stone. Jalman sweeping through the shadows, rock-pick and unstable knife slashing through the fossilized flesh, casting down beasts 3 times his size effortlessly. Elmara, hands blazing with light, unfathomably complex runes bursting into spells that brought the very armies of the dungeon to heel. Paladin of the Mask, their eyes blazing behind the seamless mask of silver, their armor gleaming bright as their hammer cleft through the rock. Shattered bone smashed the very walls of the dungeon into dust, and Othium, holding the incense aloft, murmuring prayers of the Pantheon of Seven, the very presence of the gods palpable in the deep earth. Whatever guardian they slew on that level, they left no trace of, merely a crater that still smouldered with arcane embers and melted glass. By the time they reached the grand gate of Orogotrof, the god of bones in deep places, the dungeon must have known fear. The Coruscant band knew of Orogotrof, knew what his blessing on this place meant. They must have paused to fortify themselves with enchantments and potions before proceeding through the ominous gate. The carved serpent upon the gate watched them pass, as did the hundreds of human skulls upon its arch. Due to the total layer and the length of the third level, the fourth level was far deeper and larger than any normal dungeon. Dungeon graphers speculate that it may have been several layers merged together, though they would also debate whether such a thing was possible. Either way, the air must have been thick with mana, toxic with it. Only the blessings called down upon Othium would have protected them. And the dungeon knew it. They emerged through the gate and find a vast cavern, the ceiling high enough that it was barely visible even in the band's blazing light. Before them was an underground sea, smelling of rime and decay. It appeared at first that a brilliant glowing jewels floated through the dark waters, but they were giant anglerfish, maws open, waiting to devour any that approached. Other beasts, nameless, for none have seen them before or since, no doubt taken from the deepest places of the ocean, swam about alight with bioluminescence, horrors of teeth and tentacle, maws of venom and blades, scales of steel, hides of stone, thousands of creatures, each as deadly as the last. Despite their power, the Coruscant band would not hope to fight them. In the middle of the sea was an island, and on it a simple mausoleum of granite. Upon the throne the ancient spirit of Asiatrix sat. His soul had possessed a construct of pure ancient fossil and bone, so that the mineralized bones glimmered with an icy blue light. The bones were the spines of ancient serpents, the teeth of long-dead beasts, plates, heads, and long horns, and the colossal femurs, all bound into the shape that had only the passing semblance of a hunched-over man. Even at such a distance, the band knew that it watched them. They did not know how the soul of the long-dead necromancer had made its way here, but no doubt they had heard of him in the histories and learned of his horrid deeds and great power. Tath Tolkien lobbed a potion that exploded into a blinding light, burning even as it sank into the briny water. There, through the dark but clear waters, they saw the fate of the last expedition of adventurers, and they saw been busy. But it was not done with them. The dungeon could not perform spell work, but Asiatrix could. He had laid the foundations of a spell in the deep ocean, amongst the bones, and here, in the depths of this dungeon, he would have all the mana he needed. Elmara recognized the runes at once. It was to be a spell of mass reanimation. Years and years of scouring the ocean for shipwrecks, stealing away people bit by bit, added up. This dungeon had its design set on an army, one that was nearly complete. They had just been in time. Even now, the dungeon was busy forging and looted enchantments and gems from the merchant fleets into powerful shards. There could be no delay. There was no time to gather reinforcements, but they would need to traverse the mostly deadly waters in the realms, fighting beasts that could not be fought. Fortunately for the Coruscant band, he was prepared. Othium had been quite passive compared to the others, only chanting her prayers and keeping her incense lit for most of the battles. The dungeon knew that she was the most important target, but must have thought her the least deadly of them. But she had kept a secret. She possessed the legendary achievement of water. With that, Othium, supreme priestess of the eastern reaches, was utter anathema to the dungeon. It had rocks and bones, of course, but all of it relied on water. Water that Othium could shape. The band is silent on how they did it, but one can imagine it. Perhaps she created a bridge of ice, glacial spikes warding away any of the great predators, or impaling them. Or perhaps she simply allowed them to walk on the water, and created pockets of boiling water at the flanks, flashing the icy depths into vapor when a threat approached. Perhaps she simply just had icy crystals grow inside the creatures, leaving alone their armor and simply freezing their vulnerable innards. The ocean that the dungeon had surrounded itself with became a weapon against it. As they approached the island, Asiatrix would have roared a challenge. His small work would have met Almara's, and Uthium kept the ocean at bay. Tuthtorken and the Paladin of the Mask would have charged and crippled and confused. Imagine a hammer shining with starlight smashing into the bones of the dark spellwork. Imagine Almara's fires meeting Asiatrix's curses, her runic wards and impenetrable shield. Alchemist's fire would have lit the island ablaze with color. Bit by bit, the Paladin of the Mask's hammer would shatter the soul and skeleton of the dungeon's grand guardian and ally. In the end, they were triumphant. Asiatrix's soul was incinerated in divine fire, and the terrifying dungeon core was captured. The shards and treasures pillaged from the island would end up being spread quickly across the realms, ending up in the far-flung academies and the Empress's palace as the bounty was paid out. But the most powerful shards of the core itself went to the Coruscant Band, who offed lives and stopped what could have been a plague war of death across lands and seas. Volder paused his reading, and then put the thin silk bookmark on the pages. Then he remembered where he was and coughed nervously. For a moment, reading about the grand adventure, he'd forgotten. He'd even been enjoying himself, however temporarily, looking around the grey heavens of the second level. Any peace that he'd felt quickly vanished. He looked towards the nameless dungeon, or at least near it. There was a full minute of silence, broken only by the echoing hoots of the horrible music of the ever-raucous kobolds. I require a bioluminescent fish and a mantis shrimp. They would be beautiful additions, the dungeon told Volder. Volder frowned. He had read widely enough to know that these specimens didn't actually exist in the Azrul coast. They were from the other part of the ocean. Those would be difficult to... He felt his throat tightening. I mean, of course, it'll take time to procure them, but you are right, they would be splendid indeed. He glanced around, wondering where the dungeon would actually put them in the desolate stone cavern, quite unfettered with any source of salt water. That dungeon overplayed its hand. It should have been more patient and more devious with its traps. He nodded and glanced around. It wasn't really a comment he felt he should reply to. He was also busy hoping that the dungeon would get so busy that it would forget the request about the sea creatures. He really had no idea how to begin to get them all the way to Kaltern. What happened to its core? The dungeon asked. I don't know yet. Volder squeaked as it hurriedly, but I'll endeavor to find out. Good. That was a valuable lesson. Here Volder found his jaw open ever so slightly, and then he shut it quickly. Was that praise? It felt suspiciously nice. It felt like it hadn't stopped his hands from trembling. You may go. The scholar went, following a group of rats back up, stepping furtively the whole time. All the while a kobold blew a flute in his ear, and once again Volder Claith found himself wallowing in the silent misery, wondering what new nightmares he would have next. End of chapter. And that concludes this batch video. I hope that you enjoyed. If you wish to support the channel, there are numerous ways to do so down below. Until next time, I hope that you all have a good one, and I'll see you all in the next video. Cheers.